Welcome back to the afternoon section. Before we start, let me go through our agenda this afternoon. First, we have summary of the morning, and then we have a focus section of this afternoon. And then we have section 4, keynote, 21st century skills, aspirations, planning and implementation. And the last section is presentation, teaching and learning transversal skills in Vietnam. And let me introduce Yuto Kitamura, University of Tokyo, and Mikiko Nishimura from International Christian University, Tokyo, to present a summary of the morning.
Okay, hello, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. Let me summarize first what we have discussed in the morning. So in session 1, we had a session on rethinking 21st century skills. And Professor Kai-Min Chen indicated multiple interpretations of competencies in different countries and explained that education is a system of learning that is influenced by the context, culture, and the time. He casted 8 fundamental questions regarding the 21st century skills. Those questions suggest whether education as a system of learning is responsible for developing values beyond credentials. How could education develop people or human quality? Discussion following the keynote touched upon the issue of value in education, such as whether there is any universal or common value across the countries or region that could be embraced in education. We also questioned if education is ever value-free. We discussed how values are in fact transferred in classrooms, families, and community. In thinking of learning and how to perceive transversal competencies, it was also indicated that we need more attention to learning in relation to others rather than as individual values, skills, and competencies. It was also suggested that there may be some classification of values in different levels, be it individual or collective, and ladders that surround an individual and education as a system. Session 2 was focusing on ASEAN's transversal competencies education, policy, research, and practice, in which we had panelists from ASEAN countries, namely the Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia, and Vietnam. Each panelist elaborated the current education policy, reform, and practice in transversal competencies education. It was shown that ASEAN countries have harmoniously adopted transversal competencies in their education policy with a combination of top-down and bottom-up policy formation. Questions were then asked, as in how to visualize and practice it in classrooms, and how to assess competencies beyond mastery of knowledge-based content. The panelists addressed various factors that determine the actual implementation, including teachers' perception of teaching profession, teachers' conventional top-down attitude and behavior, overloaded curriculum with less freedom of teachers, unconducive school environments such as overcrowded classrooms, outdated textbooks, and a short-term assessment structure. We discussed the needs of transforming teacher education to be more purpose-driven rather than mechanistic technical training, with more focus on civic mind, dialogue, and reflection, as well as adoption of technological advancement. We also note the importance of coherence and alignment in curriculum, assessment, and pedagogy. In session 3, which focused on competence-based reforms and disciplinary content, Professor Catherine Anderson-Levitt presented her comparative case studies of competence-based reforms and disciplinary context in France, Russia, and Uruguay. By highlighting 3 contentious views on skills and competencies, such as disciplinary versus competencies, cognitive versus personal competencies, and complex versus simple competencies, she presented how teachers and policymakers can disagree on education and implementation process of the education reforms. The question was then asked about what is the role of teachers in the reform process? Discussants raised some key points with regard to contextual factors which may explain different reaction of teachers and the linkage of such reform with assessment, the linkage of the education reform with demands of the labor market, and the high-stakes examinations that are prevalent in the Asian context. So having listened to all the presentation and discussion, I think that we have raised the fundamental question of value in education, the necessity of multidimensional and comprehensive approach to practice, and perhaps most importantly, going back to the question of why are we learning together in the education system? What is the role of teachers and other stakeholders in education, and how education makes everyone happy? So reflecting on my own experience in working in Africa, mainly in Kenya and Uganda, and also having done some study on decentralization, I had some sort of 2 points to kind of throw my scent. I just came back from Kenya last Sunday, to be secretly telling you. And I did some kind of research on the current education system in Kenya. And a lot of teachers, parents, and also education administrators told me that competency-based curriculum puts a lot of burden on teachers, parents, and communities because it explores a very fundamental thing. You have to pick the fruits, or you have to bring the boiled chicken. You have to bring with the pieces of clothes to make a new clothes. It's very innovative, very fun. But when it comes to a very rural area, a very under-resourced area, or socioeconomically disadvantaged families, is a lot of burden. So I just would like to draw your attention to socioeconomic differences to cope with this new curriculum and innovation. My second point is in Asia, in the past practice of decentralization in the 1990s onwards, we had some sort of research accumulation that says in Asia, although we devolve authority to local people, teachers, we kind of hardly see any innovative change. Because we prioritize hierarchical and traditional ways of behaving. We respect teachers as a kind of senior person or more educated person. And so somehow this kind of curricular change or education reform can be influenced by this sort of social cultural context that respect hierarchy, order, and cultural silence. So in this context, we could probably deepen our discussion further. So now let me ask Professor Kitamura to make comments and reflection on the morning sessions. Thanks.
Thank you. During the lunchtime, I discussed with Mikiko, Professor Nishimura, about the morning sessions, and I would like to basically echo the 2 points she raised in her last comments. First one is socioeconomic disparities, and then in the last session in the morning, we have touched upon the linkage between education and labor market. And then we have to really think of the dynamic changes of the labor market, particularly in the context of ASEAN. I mean, of course, this happens in many countries around the world. But, you know, you see the sort of the Y-shape trend of the divide between the jobs which require more high skills and then jobs which can be very routine and manual work based and then can be replaced by the machines and technologies. And thinking of the divide or disparities between elites and mass, which was highlighted by the presentation by Kathleen, Professor Anderson Levitt. If we unconsciously promote the competency-based curriculum reform, I mean, without paying enough attention on the possibility of the socioeconomic divisions, we may just simply give more advantage to those people who can benefit more from such curriculum reform. And then the change of the trend of that labor market accelerates the disparities between those classes. So we really have to think thoroughly what sort of the curriculum reform we have to think of. The second point is about the context of Asia. Mikiko also, I mean, in her second comment, she talked about Asian culture and society. You know, we have certain kind of, for instance, culture of seniority, hierarchy in our society, and then which is very strong in school culture as well. And at the same time, we really have to think the diversity of Asian societies as well. And when we discuss about values, I have been kind of struggling throughout the morning sessions, whether we can really promote, we can really think of the common set of values or a diverse sets of values. And is there any universal values to promote, or very diversified values, which is very contextual and reflecting the different culture and cultural context of Asian countries? Of course, in ASEAN, we have been observing very interesting phenomena of creating ASEAN community. Basically, ASEAN community, as far as I understand, the economic motivation was the driving force to create the unity in the region. However, at the same time, the ASEAN countries have been trying to share the common system in social culture dimensions as well. Education is a very good example. I mean, ASEAN countries have a standardized educational system, and then now you are teaching ASEAN studies to your students to share the common values, to share the common history. Whether you still have a question whether you can have a single history or multiple histories in the region. But at least you are trying to share the historical and cultural backgrounds across the borders in the region. So I see this effort in ASEAN is very interesting when we think of the values. The very interesting comment was made by Aaron, Professor Benabot, in the morning session about lingua franca. Lingua franca means, we use certain terminology to discuss about the competence-based curriculum reforms, and then transversal competencies. His example was about the Japanese teachers and classrooms using the terminology of critical thinking. And although we have Japanese translation of critical thinking, we don't basically use that Japanese translation in the context of discussing about transversal competencies, as Aaron lightly explained to us. The reason why, because the Japanese translation of critical thinking implies, the way, the certain behavior to blame others. The critical is, critique. It's criticizing others. So in Japanese culture, if you just simply use our Japanese translation of critical, then you have a long implication too. So that's why we cannot translate that terminology, and then we simply use the English word in our context. But then what is happening? People really don't understand what this actually means fully. So these kind of challenges, I think we can find a lot in ASEAN as well. In Vietnam, I'm sure you have as well. So, but then what can we do? I think this kind of opportunity of having this kind of conference is the good, the opportunities we have. We can share what have been discussed, and then, we can think further about this. So even in the morning session, I think we have had a much better understanding about the terminologies, for instance, and then how we should promote certain curriculum reforms. But at the same time, I think the morning session raised more questions to us. So I very much look forward to the afternoon session to, to share new ideas, but also inspire us to raise more questions as well. So that is kind of the conclusion of our summary of the morning sessions. But if any speakers or panelists, if Mikiko and I missed to mention any important topic, please join us to share the our discussion in the morning session. Anybody? Have we done okay? Okay. Thank you. So thank you, Miko. So this is the end of the summary of the morning sessions. And then can we move on to the session 4 because we too are the moderators?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for a very nice and comprehensive summary of the morning session. And now we move to the session 4. And please, Professor Kitamura and Nishimura. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So now I
We have a photo session now.
Yes.
Oh, by the way, the
Okay,
MC just noticed that we need to have a photo section first.
And we have a session for this afternoon. So can I please just invite, ask all of our guests to turn on the camera so we can start the photo section.
Very lively.
So on the count of 3, 1, are you all ready? Okay, so on the count of 3, 1, 2, 3. Thank you very much. And now session 4, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Before the session 4, is there any way we can get the photos? I'm sure the secretariat
We will
will
share
send that.
the photo to all of the.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate. Okay, so now I give the microphone back to Mikiko for the introduction of the session 4.
Thank you very much. Once again, good afternoon, everyone. And this is session 4, keynote. Today, we are honored to have a distinguished guest speaker, Professor Esther Kerr. Let me introduce her to you. Professor Esther Kerr is a professorial fellow at University of Melbourne in Australia, and also a former senior fellow with the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. She leads global projects that explore the integration of 21st century skills into national education policy and practice. Beyond focusing on innovative methods for assessment of 21st century skills, she explores the implications of introducing these skills into the curriculum for classroom practices and pedagogies. Professor Kerr now focuses in countries in Asia, and is working with national assessment systems in reform processes and integration of 21st century skills into large-scale assessment. With that, let me invite you, Professor Esther, to make your presentation. Floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's good to talk to you all. So what you can see there, I hope, is my screen at the moment. And we'll talk through these issues of aspirations, planning, and implementation. So I think it's interesting that we think in terms of a linear process, that first of all, we aspire, then we plan, and then we implement. And today I'm going to talk about those 3 components. In fact, I think as we increasingly move into untrodden paths, that linear ideal is very rarely realized. So as an example, I'm currently team leader for an Asian Development Bank project in the Philippines. It's been brought about by the pandemic, and we're seeking to find a way to continue learning for students in remote locations in far-flung areas of the Philippines, going from right up north of the island of Luzon, through the middle areas, Bohol and a little island off that, and then right down to the south to Zamboanga in Mindanao. Now, when one looks to implement a project, one typically has a clear statement of intent. We have listed outcomes and deliverables, and the overarching arbiter is to deliver as planned with smooth sailing from beginning to end. One's looking for success. You're either confirming a model or you're collecting evidence to inform a hypothesis. This EdTech Solutions project, though, is a pilot project. And that is a magic word, pilot, because what it does is it provides you with the license to learn as you go and to diverge from the plan or the path that was originally conceptualized. And I think that 21st century skills or transversal competencies shifts are just like this. They're just like a pilot. We learn as we go. So the aspirations are explicit, but even they are modified as we learn more and more about the phenomenon of interest, the transversal competencies. So I'm going to talk first about those aspirations. Look at these questions. The first one, are transversal competencies the vehicles for learning and teaching? Is that what they're for? And we can see the classroom. Or are transversal competencies themselves, ipsi, are they the end goals? Or are these transversal competencies preparation for life? The answer has major implications for teaching and even more for assessment. So vehicles for learning, that is to be more exploratory, to think critically, to make sense of the instructional materials. If they're goals in themselves, what would that mean? Does that mean at the end of your school you get a tick for problem solving, or you get 80 out of 100 for communication? If they're preparation for life, then that's about navigating a very dynamic world where we need to maintain our essential quality, and that is that we are adaptive. So of course, the answer is probably all three of these are true, that we'd answer in the affirmative for all of them. But each of them has implications for how we teach, how we develop, or how we nurture the competencies and how we assess them. So that's the aspirations, pretty brief, right? And we'll spend a lot more time on the planning and the implementation. So for planning, we know that we need alignment within our education systems for these to work coherently. It's very well known, it's talked about all the time. So if we concentrate on the diagram in the left-hand side of the screen for now, the learning goals that are in the middle, the learning goals that we set, in turn, they determine how each of the contributing parts of the delivery system need to be reviewed. All right, so the learning goals here in the middle, they determine the curriculum. They determine what is to be taught, and it influences how to teach. And it influences the development of the assessment strategies that are going to reinforce the goals and move us toward those goals. And what you can see in the diagram is the reciprocity throughout. So there's reciprocal influences between each of these on each other. And note that I don't actually have a reciprocal link back to the learning goals, but I do think that over time, these get changed and influenced also by virtue of implementation of this coherent system. So the introduction of transversal competencies highlights the need for a whole school approach where there are consistent practices and orientations throughout a school. If we want to transform the outcomes of education, we can't afford the sort of traditional silo nature of disciplinary divisions in schools. So if we make the assumption that we're interested in enhancement of transversal competencies, and the mere fact that you say enhancement means that we make a presumption that all of these competencies exist within the individual already. And what we're interested in the education system is enhancing them, developing them. We, at least I am anyway, I am very much focused on transferability. So if I think about a skill that is transferable, think about communication. What we want is somebody who can communicate with a child, communicate with an adult, about daily events, about technical matters, about matters of the soul and the spirit, in the home and in the workplace. Or I can think about problem solving, that I understand a process that I can enact to solve why something I cooked didn't work. The rice ended up soggy, or to solve why an employee is not performing well, or to solve an issue in technical assessment task development. So that ability to apply transversal competencies across multiple areas will be facilitated by practicing these across diverse areas and in the basic education system across different subjects or disciplines. So we need teachers across those different subject areas all to understand the transversal competencies and to see their relevance and their functionality. And that means shifting schools away from a total reliance on discipline-based organisation of school management. Now, we also need, going over to the diagram on the right-hand side, to decide on the balance between focal areas in education. We don't have time in a 6 to 7 hour school day for in-depth focus on everything that's regarded as important. And our schools traditionally have been established to teach knowledge and foundational literacies like numeracy and language. So looking at this green diagram, we can see the intersection of categories. And the question arises, how do we optimize the intersections between those three areas? And that's, of course, where we need to think through with our planning. So I've been thinking a lot about the logic of this over the last, I guess, 12 to 15 months. And this sort of logic model, it appeals to me. I don't like particularly complex models, but I do like ones that have a clear logical flow. So we need to, when we're planning, to go back to the goals and see what they determine for us. The goals themselves, we need to dissect them so that we focus on them. Dissecting them means that we can see all of the pieces of what we want to implement into a plan. We've got to be very careful not to be over-inclusive. Like, I've heard of many, many really good things in life and education, but the reality is we can't include them all. So each national system has its own learning goals, and those goals need to be the focus rather than having a grab bag of every model or every human characteristic or competency that exists. So in the boxes beneath my grey headers, I've pulled a few examples from different countries. So this isn't a nice logical flow in terms of the examples, but I want to give some feel for what would populate these boxes. So we can see the first one from Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka is currently reviewing its national curriculum framework. And so what I would want to do if I were going through this process with Sri Lanka is think about, well, if they've said that's the goal, then I need to be thinking about what content do I need to include in the curriculum and how am I going to manage that in order to ensure that I get healthy, stress-free, inquisitive students out of it. That dissection, looking at each of those, that will determine the content of the curriculum. And here's an example from Singapore's primary education system about content in the curriculum. We can see statements about subject discipline areas. We can see information about what they call the knowledge skills, and we can see information about character dispositions. one of the very interesting things in terms of the discourse over the last few hours and the issue of values continually arising is that different people have different models, and they partition all of these different human competencies and characteristics differently. And so here we see a different way of looking at things and different nomenclature for them. Personally, I don't think it much matters within a country what you call things or how you partition them, as long as you're focusing on those goals and making sure that everything flows. Content. Then we need to think about that green diagram that we looked at before. How do you optimize the linking subject area thinking that we've got here from Singapore and the character? How do we link the literacies, the transversal competencies, and the content? We link it with our structure and our strategies. So we put into play different structures within our education systems. We adopt different philosophies of education so that we can manage the content in a way that is linked back to the goals. So we've got an example here from the Philippines, and putting new ways of thinking about their K-12 curriculum, their basic education system. And we can see here some of the main areas that they're starting to look at. We can see how we need to wrap the content in order to produce students with the competences that we need. So they're talking about curriculum review. And under the current pandemic, of course, as was mentioned this morning by our colleague from the Philippines, starting to streamline curriculum to look at what's most essential and so on. So there'll be lots of different strategies and structures in order to maximize the impact of the content back toward the goals. So the direct linking from the goals to wrapping the content then is hypothesized to end up with some competencies. And what I have here is a couple of examples, one from Australia, as we are part of the Asia Pacific, and South Korea. And the competencies describe exactly what the learners are expected to be able to do. And so if we tracked backwards from Australia's statement here about confidence and creativity, being active and informed citizens, we would expect to find pedagogical approaches, instructional materials that would support those outcomes. So it's a very nice, easy, simple way of looking at things. Of course, as we know, aspirations are one thing, planning is another thing, and then we get to implementation. So what do transversal competencies actually look like then across these three interlinked areas? And a couple of examples here. How do countries meld those different areas of learning, the knowledge and the competencies? How do they meld them together for implementation? So we have an example here from the Philippines, and both the Philippines and the Australian example show how a transversal competencies perspective permeates their curriculum subject level descriptions. So in the Philippines area here, this is the K-12 maths conceptual framework. And if you read it through, they're basically saying the major goals here are critical thinking and problem solving. They're the goals of maths. So very interesting perspective that they see very, very clearly that logical flow of the content and the competency. And if we look at the the Australian example, here it's interesting. I pulled out the economics and business strand of subject areas. And what this paragraph talks about is how critical and creative thinking contribute to enterprise and business innovation. So these two examples show you a very nice way of identifying what flows together from the subject or the knowledge area and from the transversal competencies areas. Moving away from curriculum, what happens to assessment? And I'll talk about assessment for a little bit. We need to think about, are we assessing transversal competencies because we want to estimate how students' competencies are developing, or because we believe there is some magic level that you need to achieve? And if so, what would that level be and how would it be established? So we need to think about how useful that type of assessment is to countries, as opposed to assessment in language and maths or science. And if we think about international large-scale assessments, of course, for many years now, many countries have been assessing the traditional subject areas. Now, as you can see in this table, we're finding that many countries in Asia are showing a very strong interest in looking at transversal competencies. And we can see, for example, we have the Philippines, we have Vietnam, Indonesia, China, Thailand, Korea, many countries that are engaging more and more in these international large-scale assessments of transversal competencies. So what for? Are the assessments impacting curriculum development, or are they undertaken to provide another perspective on national testing, for example? One thing that we do know is that results from international large-scale assessment, they stimulate discussion. They stimulate discussion at country level. Some of that discussion, as we know, is really unhelpful, but some of that discussion is incredibly helpful. It provides other angles on national assessments, and it can stimulate exploration of what's happening in the classroom. And that actually is precisely what happened 2 years ago now in the Philippines. And Joy Pangilinan referred to this in session 2 this morning. So I was technical lead for a UNICEF study which was designed to identify how transversal competencies were reflected in classrooms. They were already testing at the national level, but they wanted to know what happens in the classroom, what happens in terms of assessment, what happens in terms of pedagogy, how is the embedding of the transversal competencies in the curriculum articulated into practice in the classroom. And as Joy mentioned this morning, what that study did was reveal some very basic misunderstandings of the nature of the skills. Those misunderstandings are not limited to any one country. Although the graphic you can see in front of you now, this is 5-6 years ago now. And this study was undertaken through NECMAP, the UNESCO Bangkok. And I think a number of you who are here today were part of this study and part of the next one I'll talk about. And the study highlighted a whole lot of contradictions and inconsistencies. We had researchers from 9 countries participating, and they asked this question of the teachers: what is the purpose of assessment of non-academic student competencies in the classroom? And they responded about whether it was for instructional purposes or for grading. And you can see the distribution. The grey meant there was no answering. The pink is a combination of the two. And you can see, yes, there are differences across the countries to quite a strong degree. However, notwithstanding that the teachers answered this question, there was in fact very little evidence of classroom assessment of transversal competencies at all at the time. And that is a finding that we corroborated 3 years later. And again, some of the same countries 3 years later in a similar study, sampling from a small number of schools, as well as at national level in most of the countries, we found indications that there were very few assessment tools that were specifically developed for transversal competencies, even though they might have been labelled that way. If you look at the left-hand side of the graphic and the blue endorsements in them, you can see that there are very few cases where the TVC assessment was actually specifically and directly developed for that purpose. And if you look over at the right-hand side, you can see there were even fewer examples of reporting against the competencies. Why does reporting matter? It matters. Let's look at this. What's the evidence that assessment takes place? In some ways, it's one of the most visible aspects of our education systems. Students and parents know it's happening. In many countries, you get lists of high achievers published in the daily newspaper, or they're on sideboards along the roads and so on. But if we want real evidence that transversal competencies are valued, we'd see other signs. We would see reporting. So if it's reporting for accountability, what sort of evidence would we see? If it was at national or regional level, we would see large-scale assessments happening. And of course, that is what we're seeing. At school level, you'd probably see something in student report cards. And in classroom, you'd find the student records done by the teachers. And if it's for instructional purposes, somewhat like formative assessment, then again, you would think you would find evidence in student records, assessment tasks, and classroom observations. And in that UNICEF study that I just referred to, we did those classroom observations and we didn't see anything. And a lot of that was to do with the fact that the teachers didn't really understand the nature of the skills. So that takes us to pedagogy. What are the pedagogical implications of transversal competencies? Since we're looking for learners to be more exploratory, more experimental, more application focused, we need to see this in the teaching strategies. However, if we look on the left-hand side here, the traditional teacher-directed approach is characterized by structure, clarity, explanation, immediate feedback, and hopefully encouragement. So it's very responsive in a sense. Everything is answered straight away, and that's not what our world is like. Our world is not all predictable and we get answers straight away all the time. So a transversal competencies approach will be learner-centered, preparing young people for self-directed learning, for managing their time, thinking about how to solve their own problems and persevering, finding different and creative ways of dealing with their learning and having the confidence to approach their studies in ways that they can work independently. And, you think about this lot of competencies here. These are the competencies that tragically have been brought to the fore by the pandemic. These are exactly the competencies that many of our learners studying alone in remote environments without teacher guidance, without the structure of traditional instruction, this is what they need. So where are we? Very quickly, what makes a learning environment? think about it, learning is a cognitive, social, emotional, and behavioral set of processes. I don't know if you've seen the main image in this photo, but images such as these over the last 20 months have evoked very powerful emotional reactions. Because what is it? What is it that's missing? We see these children in their playtime. We see a setup here so that students can be in the same classroom together, somewhat divided. We see self-learning modules that are sent out to students so that they can study alone or they can work on computers or tablets alone. So what's missing? It's cognitive, social, emotional, and behavioural environments that help to nurture exactly those sorts of competencies and learning structures. So the pandemic has been, it sounds horrible, but in one sense, it's been a positive indicator for transversal competencies, because it shows very clearly that there are limitations in our traditional classroom environments, because it does not encourage, it does not teach our children to be able to manage independently. So what stands in the way of our visions? There are some obstacles here and there are some facilitating factors. So outdated views of the nature of education is one obstacle. There are some people who think that knowledge is the only thing. The reality is that we have had such an explosion in knowledge over the last century that there's no way we can cover everything appropriately in the basic education sector. So we need to help learners to learn themselves. There's a lack of understanding of the nature of the skills, as I mentioned, and that I think is right across all levels of an education sector. We have these silo type structures of curriculum and teacher management, the structures of how a school works, that might sometimes mean that not all teachers are being able to are being given the opportunity to have same understanding about these particular skills. And we've had a lack of movement in the higher education sector, which is a little bit of a red herring, but just something I wanted to put out there. But we've got lots of very positive things. We've got greater valuing of non-routine capabilities. It's understood that our students need to be able to make decisions when faced with the unknown. We've got an increasing valuing of holistic development, and we've got a growing dissatisfaction with the outcomes of our education systems. So all of these help us to start thinking about where to go in the future. So the logic, if each of you think about your own country, where is your country? Are the goals clear? Do they determine the content? Is the content wrapped up in ways that will ensure that content is provided in a learning environment that is compatible with the competencies that you want for your students in the end? So there's no doubt that transversal competencies are on the radars of the majority of countries. The thing is that there are many paths to take, and there's lots of decisions about which paths to take and how they'll be constructed. How they'll be constructed to reflect each national vision and context. So I hope that we see this shift toward transversal competencies as one we're continuing to learn and continuing to realise that there are many parts, not just one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kerr. So now let us introduce two distinguished discussants for today's session. So firstly, let me introduce Dr. Sun Sang-yo. Dr. Sun Sang-yo is Associate Professor in the Department of Education and Director of the Global Education Corporation, one of the interdisciplinary graduate programs at Seoul National University, South Korea. Prior to the current position, he worked as a research fellow of the Korean Educational Development Institute and Hankuk University of Foreign Studies after obtaining PhD in education from the University of California, Los Angeles, with a specialization of international and comparative education. He has taught many interesting courses, including global citizenship education and social justice transformative education. And he has actively participated in practices of international education development cooperation programs in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America. So with that, could Professor Yo pose some question or comment to the presentation made by Professor Kerr, please?
Well, thank you so much for your very warm introduction. Actually, it's my wrong gestures to provide long, short bio. Thank you so much. Well, it is my great pleasure and high privilege to be part of participants in the event, International Conference on Learning Transversal Competencies in Asian countries and neighbors. Well, as I was introduced, I'm a professor of education department and then a director of Global Education Corporation, which is an interdisciplinary graduate program to explore intermixed field with education, development studies, and evaluation studies. Seoul National University. Well, I enjoyed the presentation by Professor Kerr. Then let me give my response in a very frank way. I'm not quite sure how long I can spend for my response, but I believe I can spend 6 to 7 minutes with 5 points. At first, the arguments for new concepts in learning, including competency-based education and transversal competencies in education, keep growing in the world when distinctions from disciplinary knowledge is supposed to be emphasized. However, I'm not yet fully persuaded of the difference among these. The meaning that competency rather than knowledge would be taught and learned at school classroom needs to be more clearly articulated and explained. Furthermore, the meaning of evaluation on that transversal competency would be taught and learned need to be further explained. Then, additionally, what does it mean to evaluate transversal competencies learning when final task of learning would be composed of items to ask how much knowledge students know? For example, it is Korea, out of many countries, who adopted the concept of the 21st century skills as a core and key foundation on curriculum reform, innovative teaching and learning, and new circumstances for school innovation. However, rare changes happened there in relation to its implementation into classroom activities for 21st century skills. KSAT, Korea Scholarship Aptitude Test for college entrance exam, stands in the middle of most important goal of learning at all, which is totally based upon knowledge rather than 21st century skills. Even though there are some rhetoric that such exams could cover the 21st century skills, it would be private sectors rather than public arena to affect the link between the idea of what to know and how to be evaluated. Those countries touched upon in this event, such as Japan, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, etc., may have quite similar situations. Please consider the horrendous situation of education system where public sphere of education has been long colonized and oppressed by private desire to pursue social status through education. Thirdly, I believe 21st century skills sounds really wonderful. Without doubt, it presumably makes every effort to realize those skills into the system in each country. However, we need to keep in mind that each country has a different way of understanding adoption, realization, implementation, practices, and outcomes in practice. They are quite different, while the same concepts and the same word would be adopted into the policy. The same goals pursued by each would be often deflected into different outputs and be betrayed without aimed fruit. In reality, it heavily depends upon the context and situation where an education system would like to take advantage of those for what purpose. For example, ESD, Education for Sustainable Development, has been greatly utilized as a bridge to improve academic scores, particularly in PISA, by adopting, making, and implementing the frame of ESD by particularly Ministry of Education, Japan. It was researched by one of my students in the program. I don't think that improvements of academic score is not at least a main goal of ESD, but officials in Ministry of Education have taken advantage of ESD to mediate to it. I believe that those who are involved with policymaking and policy implementation should be concerned about the fact of what these gaps between policy goals and practice continue making differences around the world in many different levels, and worstly, of why such good and sound policy intentions would be resisted, challenged, and betrayed by whom. I wonder what strategy Professor Kerr envisions to make a difference for the purpose of realizing promised goals of the 21st century skills, when there should be a consideration of difference in outcomes beyond different contexts out there. Fourthly, so it should be problematized that teacher posed in different contexts cannot become a change maker when policy reforms onto teachers continue to ask result-based accountability. Neither does this paper contain such intervention and implications for quality teachers. I wish Professor Kerr would come up with a prospective response to what support and what training would be adequately provided with a view to realization of the 21st century skills to be put into place as school classroom. Lastly, in fact, I'm one of those who think that authentic contribution of the 21st century skills would be dubious. For the discourse of the 21st century skills may be closely incorporated with economic discourse, and finally look for economic returns through effectiveness in academic achievement, then the concept of 21st century skills would be critically viewed as a subjective policy to economy, while strengthening economic colonization of education. Please allow me to ask you, Professor Kerr, how education as it is valued for itself can strategize and take advantage of the 21st century skills, to enrich what education needs to be when education uniquely contributed to sustainable economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Yo, for your very inspiring and also probably some provocative ideas. Let me probably introduce the second discussant before going into the full discussion. Mr. Do Duc Lan. Okay, he is the Deputy Head of Research Management, Postgraduate Training and International Cooperation Department, Vietnam Institute of Educational Sciences, VNIES. He got a BSc in Math and Master's degree in Mathematics Education from Hanoi National University of Education, Vietnam. After almost 10 years of working as a mathematics teacher in secondary school, he joined VNIES since 2013. Mr. Lan has been involved in the roles of coordinator and principal investigator in national and international projects on curriculum, pedagogical innovation, 21st century skills assessment, and STEM education. His area of research include how to use the technology best in mathematics and STEM education, and STEM approach to develop digital skills of students. So with that, let me invite.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction. Let me check the technical again. So is this okay right now? Okay. So thank you so much for your kind introduction, Mikiko. So I would like first of all I would like to thank BIS and also NISAM for organizing this very meaningful conference. Also at the end of the year, and also we look forward to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the BNIS establishment. And I listened to all the presentations from the morning up to now, and also from the presentation of Professor Esther. I also ever met her sometimes, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, when Esther she came to assist MOE of Vietnam to design the new curriculum. So before I have some comments and also some of my answer questions to Professor Cass and also other panelists and also the moderator, and I would like to give you a little bit of the context of Vietnam. Of course, transversal competencies or 21st century skills are quite familiar to us in recent 10 years. We have a trend to renovate in education since early 2010s, and after that we have a lot of policies to enhance that process. So that's why since 2013 to 2016 we established the Bureau of the Curriculum Developers with the support of some international organizations and also some support of AARC from Melbourne University at the time. They also came to Vietnam to have some training courses for the team curriculum developers to how to develop the new curriculum based on the the competencies. So, and after that in 2018 MOE Ministry of Education in Vietnam, we published the new curriculum, what we call curriculum 2018. So in that curriculum, we mentioned about we have a very important shift from the knowledge-based curriculum into competency-based curriculum. And in that curriculum, it includes also the qualities of the learners we should develop and also promote for the learners. For example, like patriotic, kind, diligent studying, hardworking, honest, or responsible. And we also mentioned in the curriculum about 3 what we call key competencies, general competencies: critical thinking and problem solving, self-control and self-learning, and communication and collaboration, and also some what we call discipline competencies, for example, like about numeracy or ICT competency. So so far Vietnam has been implementing the new curriculum with the grade 2 with grade 1 in 2020, the school year 2020, and now we are implementing the new curriculum for grade 2 and so on, and we are going to have the full new curriculum in 2024 and 2025 school year. So that is the context of Vietnam. And we as Dr. Phương mentioned in the session 3 in the morning, we also had a lot of controversial arguments, and also we have a lot of debates about the definitions of the terms, what are competencies, how many competencies should be embedded in the curriculum, and also what should be the different stakeholders. So back to the presentation of Professor Esther, I would like also to have 4 or 5 comments and also have some of the questions as well. So first thing I think because the process when Professor Esther mentioned, we have the learning goals. After that, that is a theory. We have the process of learning goals, contents, structures, strategies, and competencies. But one of the key thing here is we have to make sure that we have the mutual understanding between all stakeholders, from policymakers, educators, teachers, also parents and students, because sometimes I think the idea of the many developing countries, they want to have the high quality human resource. So that's why they define, or maybe they have made some decisions to develop some sets of skills or some sets of the competencies based on the need and the command of the economies. So but the educators and also the people who are working in the educational field, they have a different understanding, they have different ideas. So that is my very first point. And the second point is that is about the process to do it, because sometimes we don't have enough information. We don't have enough evidence base. For example, when we define some competency like communication and collaboration competencies, before we design the curriculum, we don't have a lot, enough data, or we don't know where we are now. So we don't know about the current status of the students' competencies. So that's why when we have the curriculum, we cannot make sure that the next step should be implemented in the right way. So that is my second point. The third point, that is about the assessment processes, because assessments is a very important component to make sure that everything is going well, and make sure that the learning achievements is whether is achieved or not. So, but the assessment, that is very, very difficult, because our current in Vietnam is also, that is the case, that we usually consider assessments just like about examination. Many educational educational institutions in many countries, they also don't put assessments as a very important roles as it should be. And also, the concepts of the assessment, sometimes we have misunderstanding about the assessment. In for example, like this, we have to assess the knowledge. We also have to assess the skills. And how can we know that the person, the students who have strong knowledge, they also have they also have a very strong skills, transversal skills. And also about the assessment tools, that is the holistic assessment tool, or maybe the assessment tools for the X competency. That is also something is might be very, very confused for the how should I say, implementers like teachers, and also at the school level. And in here, I also want to make one comment on about the process. We usually forget about the median people. For example, like school managers, or maybe educational managers at several levels, like the provincial levels, or maybe the district levels. So we don't include them in the process, or maybe we don't have enough. Maybe strong how should I say, maybe strong focus. We just focus on teachers, students, curriculum, but we don't have enough focus on the school leaders or maybe the other medium educational managers. That is my third point. And also I would like to continue with the third point. That is back to the not only the presentation, but also that is a quite controversial questions. Competency-based curriculum. How long will it last? Or maybe it might be in 10 years, in 2030, or maybe 2040. Maybe we will get back to the concept of knowledge-based curriculum. Because as far as I know, I have many friends who are working in the, industrial areas. They just say that, oh, we just need the knowledge of the IT, in-depth AI knowledge or something like that. We don't need something like communication or maybe collaboration skills. So that is also the questions for us, our educators, to think and also to discuss. And my very last point is that is about I think that for recent 2 years and also in 10 years, the technology, it would be the very, very key role to define or maybe to drive the competencies. Whether it be, I'm not sure, but I think that the technologies should be a very, very key component to make the very great impact on what we decide to develop for the students, and also to put some new ideas in the educational reform or maybe transformation of the education. So that is several my comments on in general, and also to some questions to Professor Esther. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. What inspirational comments and responses. We have only a few minutes left, so I think Professor K, you can pick up 1 or 2 points you you'd like to respond to, and then
Sure.
try to.
All right.
Could you try to respond in like 3 minutes? I'm so sorry.
Okay. I think maybe 3 hours would do it, but okay. I'll go very quickly through some of the things. So one thing is that I think we need to be very careful about distinguishing between competency-based education and transversal competencies. We are talking about 2 separate things here. And so I won't go any further than that. Obviously, the implications of integration of transversal competencies does have implications and overlap with competency-based teaching and assessment and the rest, but these are not the same things. So we need to be pretty careful with the language. A very quick point about why should we bother to assess transversal competencies if we're just going to have test items that are testing knowledge. Now, if you are going to have test items that are only going to test knowledge, then absolutely, why would you be testing transversal competencies? But the other question is, do you really want to spend all of your examinations and testing time to find out whether students can store knowledge and then retrieve it? Can we maybe do something else with our minds than merely taking something, storing it, and then giving it back out again in exactly the same form? The reality is, and this goes more to the point about, that Lan just made, is we need to be thinking about what is the value of education? What is education for? And this also goes to Sung Sang Yu's point. Is education valued for itself? Or is education a preparation for life? And of course it is. You go back to the Latin root. It's to lead out. That's the whole purpose of education, that we educate our children so that they can lead constructive lives. Yes, there might be some people who want to be in an ivory tower and just enjoy learning for their own sake, but that is not why we have universal education. We have universal education so that we can learn to live together in a constructive way. So what's another point I'd like to pick up on? Oh, yes. it's going to look very different in every country. Absolutely. That when you have one set of national goals in Vietnam and another set of national goals in Kenya and another set of national goals in Bhutan, your education system looks different. You manage your education systems differently. You structure them differently. You use different pedagogical principles differently. So the concept of using transversal competencies to increase the functionality of your education system does not mean that we're all going to look the same. We never have, and hopefully we never would. And I guess just a nice point that Lan made, this issue around assessment and examinations, that, you know, assessment obviously is not just about accountability. Now we do use assessment as a way of helping to instruct, of changing the way we teach. And one of the very unfortunate things that's happened because of the global pandemic is, of course, teachers can't be in the classroom, so they can't have that recognition of where students are every now and again, so that they can pick up on where this student, what's the proximal zone of development, where do I intercede now? So that function of assessment, I think, is a particularly difficult one for us to deal with at the moment. And the sort of support and training needed, if I can put something maybe in the chat later on, but we have done quite a bit of work in finding out how much nurturing do you need, how much support do you need to give teachers so that they can think about how do they teach. And it's not about a teacher standing up in front of a class and saying, we are going to learn communication today. What it's about is the teacher modeling behaviours and encouraging behaviours on the part of the student as they deal with the knowledge-based content of the system that we need to look to. So let's not get into a nonsense about its knowledge versus transversal competencies. These are complementary and they can help our students. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With very limited time slot, you have nicely and clearly explained and discussed. And I was told by the organizer to pick up one question, because there is a question in the Q&A box, question regarding how to assess the interactions between students and teachers. If Professor Kea, do you have any comments on these questions?
I'm just looking at the question now. I think maybe the two paragraphs are not really focused on the same thing. So I'll just focus on the first part.
Mm-hmm.
If the question from Mr. Van is how can we assess collaboration or communication, then we can put assessment tasks together to do that. And much of the work I've been doing for the last 4 or 5 years under the Optimising Assessment for All project has been about working in Nepal, Cambodia, Mongolia, and over in East Africa to identify ways that we can do that through classroom tasks where the students, again, are dealing with the content of their subject disciplines, but then they actually need to communicate that, reason with that, solve problems with that among each other. I'm not saying it's easy to put those assessment tasks together, but it absolutely can be done. So I'm not sure if I've got that question, if I've interpreted it properly, but that's the best I can do.
Thank you very much. I think all your presentation and then discussions really leads to the next session. Because we now try. From the beginning, we were very clear that we really have to make clear what's the goals, and then we really have to be carefully discuss about the different concepts and the terms, and and so how then we can apply these ideas to the context of Vietnam. That will be the discussion to be held in the next session. So thank you very much. Very inspiring and stimulating discussions. I'd like to thank Professor Kea and Professor Yo and Mr. Bong for your wonderful contributions. So please join me to congratulate them. Thank you. And thank you, Mikiko.